How's it going, everyone? Welcome to another episode about preferments, and in this video I'll show you how to convert any recipe to be made with a preferment. To do this, you will require knowledge of baker's percentage, dough hydration, and the preferments themselves. And I have made separate videos covering those topics, and I'll leave them linked down below. If you already understand baker's percentage and dough hydration, you should be able to do this. But I will make a super simple example just to help us visualize the process. We'll make a regular loaf of bread with flour, water, yeast and salt. This loaf of bread will be made up of 500 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 6 grams of yeast and 10 grams of salt. But don't worry too much about the amounts in grams. The main thing is the percentages and understanding how much each preferment uses of water and yeast and so on. And right off the bat I can tell you that this dough will be 60% hydration. We will have 2% salt and 1.2% yeast. Now in any regular loaf of bread, you would normally pre-ferment 10 to 20% of the total flour. There are of course exceptions, you can go way higher. I have recipes where I have pre-fermented 100% of the total flour. I don't think there is much use going lower than 10%, it wouldn't impart that much flavor. But you know, if you want a little fermentation kick, why not? Try an experiment, do 5% if you want. So of course if you know baker's percentage, you will know that every other ingredient is calculated as a percentage in relation to the total dough flour. So 10% of 500 is 500 times 0.1 equals 50 grams. 20% of 500 is 500 times 0.2 equals 100 grams. The flour is always 100%. And this is where you can start adjusting the amount of flour that you use in your pre-ferment. You want 15%, 30%, just do the calculations. So that's how you work out the amount of flour in grams that you want to use in your pre-ferment. Now let's look at the 4 different pre-ferments. We have poolish, which is of Polish origin, as the name suggests. Then we have bega, which is of Italian descent, so all your favorite Italian breads can be made with this. Next up is a sponge, normally used for enriched dough. And last but not least, we got prefermented, which is actually normally made by taking a dough which is fully mixed, keeping a piece, and adding it back into your next day's dough. Now I go over these in extreme detail in my other pre-ferment video. In this video I'll just tell you the hydration percentages and how much yeast you normally use in them. Poolish is a liquid pre-ferment, so it would normally be at 100% hydration, meaning that it contains the same amount of flour and water. When it comes to the yeast, it's a tiny amount, 0.08 to 0.1%. So for every 100 grams, you would use 1/10 of a gram of yeast. The hydration of a bega can be from 50 to 100%, but normally it ranges from 50 to 60, and it uses the same amount of yeast as a Polish. The sponge would normally be at 100% or even higher. There are some recipes in which all the liquid in the recipe is used in the sponge. But to help with temperature control, I would suggest making it no more than 100% hydration. And the sponge is a quick pre-ferment, unlike the others, and it contains all the yeast in the recipe, so in this case it would contain 6 grams of yeast. That means a sponge normally takes no more than 1 hour to rise. Prefermented is unique because it's simply made by taking a piece of fully mixed dough and keeping it for the next batch. That means that all the ingredient percentages will match the final dough. So in this case, the hydration would be 60%, the salt would be 2%, and the yeast would be 1.2%. A pre-ferment like this is most convenient when you bake your bread regularly, at least 2 or 3 times a week, ideally every day. But there are several recipes in my bread with pre-ferment playlist where I simply make this from scratch. And those are the specific percentages you should know of each pre-ferment. Now you simply choose which pre-ferment you want to use, how much flour you want to pre-ferment, and then calculate the rest of the ingredients accordingly. So I'm going to make a little chart and show you a quick example on what ingredients and how much we need to use in each pre-ferment if we decide to pre-ferment 100 grams of flour. So we got our total recipe: 500 grams of flour, 300 grams of water, 6 grams of yeast, 10 grams of salt, Polish, bega, sponge, and prefermented. If we decide to pre-ferment 20% of flour, then in the Polish, you would add 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, 0.1 gram of yeast. The beaker would contain 100 grams of flour, 60 grams of water, 0.1 gram of yeast. The sponge, 100% hydration, so 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, 6 grams of yeast, because remember it contains all the yeast in the recipe. Lastly, the prefermented, having the same percentages as the main dough, we would pre-ferment 100 grams of flour, 60 grams of water, 1.2 grams of yeast, and 2 grams of salt. So we started off with a full recipe of a straight through dough. We took these ingredients out to make each pre-ferment. All we need to do now is subtract the pre-ferment amounts from the main dough, and we'll know how much to add to the final dough. So to the poolish, you would add 400 grams of flour, 200 grams of water, 5.9 grams of yeast, and 10 grams of salt. To the beaker, you would add 400 grams of flour, 240 grams of water, 5.9 grams of yeast, and 10 grams of salt. With a sponge, again 400 grams of flour, 200 grams of water, but no yeast because the yeast is already in the sponge. And all we'll do is add the salt. And the prefermented gets the same treatment, just subtract the ingredients. And that's how you turn any recipe into a recipe made with the pre-ferment. The amounts don't matter, all that matters is the percentages. But let's do a real example, let's visualize this. I've got my full dough ingredients on the left there. I'm going to make the pre-ferment out of them. In this case I'll make the poolish. So I go 100 grams of water, 0.1 gram of yeast, which is normally just a tiny pinch of yeast. And we'll add 100 grams of flour to that. Of course normally you wouldn't do it this way. You already know how much flour, yeast and water goes in your pre-ferment. You would first weigh your ingredients and make your pre-ferment. And only then you would weigh your final dough ingredients. Doing it the way I show you here would be just an inconvenience. But I thought it would be a great way to visualize it, and to show you that we're taking part of the total ingredients, mixing them and fermenting them. In this case, the poolish will take around 12 hours. As you can see, it's nice and bubbly now. And that's your pre-ferment done. Again, if you want to learn the specifics of each pre-ferment and the use of them, then click the link down below. And check out my breads with pre-ferment playlist, because I have at least 30 recipes using all the pre-ferments mentioned in this video. And I would actually suggest you do that before you do anything, if you don't have much experience with pre-ferments. It's better to try out some ready-made recipes, instead of starting to calculate and fixing up your own recipes. See what you like first, see which pre-ferment fits your schedule, because they all take different fermentation times. But the best part about pre-ferment is that you can use it in any recipe. And with some modification, you could use them interchangeably. Now whether you should or should not do it, that is up to you. I like using pre-ferments because of their benefits. They improve the flavor, they improve the texture, they improve the keeping quality of your bread. It makes it stay fresh for longer. So if you're baking large loaves and not baking very often, your bread's not going to go moldy as quick. Another huge benefit is the time savings. Because the pre-ferment adds so much flavor and character to your bread, you won't need the long bulk fermentation, because most of the work will be done overnight as your pre-ferment rises. So just spending a couple minutes making it a day ahead of time will potentially save you hours the following day. Like the bread I'm making now, it only fermented for an hour and a half before the final shaping. And I know that less than an hour later I can pop it in the oven. While normally bread like this would take 4 to 5 hours to make, it only took me 2.5. And as I said, you can make any bread with any pre-ferment, pretty much. This could have easily been done with a beaker, sponge or prefermented. The sponge might not be the best option, but it's possible. Understanding hydration, baker's percentage and the pre-ferments themselves opens a whole world of baking. It gives you freedom to create because you understand the process. And when it comes to bread, there should not be some hard rules to stick to. You can do what you like, just as long as you understand what you're doing, of course. So I really encourage you to take some time, watch my pre-ferment guide, watch my dough hydration and baker's percentage guide, and I guarantee you will instantly become a more confident home baker. But if you are already into pre-ferments, then let me know down in comments, what's your favorite bread? What's your favorite pre-ferment to use? Have you ever modified recipes? Have you used different pre-ferments in different recipes? But if you have any questions or suggestions, also let me know down in comments. And if you haven't subscribed by now, what are you waiting for? If you love bread and baking, you've come to the right place. But that's all I have for you today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.